Today we'll be discussing comedian Anthony Jeselnik's latest special, Bones and All, and we'll be discussing psychopaths and antisocial personality disorder. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic for medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing comedian Anthony Jeselnik and his latest special, Bones and All. And then we'll be discussing psychopaths and antisocial personality disorder. So, Ali, how are these connected?
We have to be quite clear that in no way do either of us think that Anthony Jeselnik has psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. You know, I think he does a character on stage that's a little bit, I don't even know. He does a dark character on stage, but even that, I don't know if we're dealing with a
Yeah, so that's why we picked it, because as you said, his character does have these, let's say he has these tendencies, the character that he portrays on stage. There you go. Definitely not what he's like in real life from what we know. And so I know sometimes we do combination topics where we say that we don't think somebody is like, say, a narcissist or, you know, has a personality disorder, but they really do. But in this case, we really do not think that he does. So just want to be absolutely clear about that before we get started. So, Ali, there's a lot of stuff to talk about today. So why don't we get right into it?
Do it!
Okay, so Ali, Anthony Jeselnik, and I always want to call him Jeselnik for some reason, whenever I read his name. Ali was proofreading my Google Doc to make sure that I didn't actually switch around some of the letters in his name. I think let's talk a bit about his background and when we first saw him, but I really want to call people's attention to this article in Cracked magazine, which you can get online. It's free, and it's a really good interview. Didn't you think, Ali, when I sent it to you?
I did. When you phrase it that way, I have no other way to answer. But as it turns out, I really did like it anyway. I actually really enjoyed it. Also because you don't get a lot of real deep dives into Anthony Jeselnik's life. And Norm MacDonald, who he talks about on his special, was similar in a way. You never really learned, outside of a close inner circle of his friends, most people will not know who the real Anthony Jeselnik is. You know, and I've said this about Norm MacDonald too. Yeah, my grandfather used to do this, and my wife this, and you're like, does this guy have a wife? Does he have a grandfather? Did any of that really happen? Who is this person? And Anthony Jeselnik's the same. But by the end, he is a slave to only one thing, as this article and this interview suggests. What is that, Asif? He's a slave to
the joke,
the craft of stand-up comedy, and the joke. Exactly. That's his only thing. You know, that's what he likes. So it doesn't matter if he's like really got a brother-in-law who did A, B, C, or really got a niece or a nephew. That's not what he's into. But yeah, I thought that this was a little deep dive into how he really feels about things. And, you know, as it turns out, we probably like the article because we like what he's saying.
Exactly. Well, let's talk a bit about his past life, and then we'll talk a bit about his comedy style, which this article really hones in on and reflects. So he basically got into comedy, kind of thought he was the class clown when he was in elementary school. He talks about this one time where a student was moving to another town, and the town wasn't that nice. And so Jeselnik was like, oh yeah, well, send us a postcard. And the point wasn't that the kids laughed, it was that the teacher laughed. And he said, okay, if you're smart enough that adults get your joke and find you funny, then you can get away with anything. And this kind of idea of humor and the intelligence behind humor, I think, permeates his stand-up comedy. And so he actually went to Tulane University and has a degree in English literature. So he actually wanted to write novels. That's where he initially started, and then he realized that that wasn't really his thing. So I don't know if you can see this with his comedy, like a writer's sensibility with his comedy.
Yes and no. I mean, you also have writers who are extremely wordy, but the words they choose are great. But then you also have writers where there's an economy of words, and the words that they do choose mean something, and there's no extra fluff. And I think that's the cloth that he's cut from. He's really very particular about his word choice and his word amount. You know, he doesn't require long setups. Everything is very, very specific. And I think he's an excellent, excellent writer. We should say, by the way, very dark comedian. Like, this is not somebody for everyone. And actually, I just pulled up his Wikipedia page. He's known for his dark comedy style, which emphasizes ironic misdirection. That's complimentary. Non sequiturs, biting insults, an arrogant demeanor. True story. And a stage persona that frequently takes amoral or psychopathic stances. I did not know that before I...
There you go.
Yeah, so we chose the right thing here.
And in fact, when he was doing stand-up, he started to tell some of these darker jokes and they really hit. So then he moved forward with those types of jokes. The joke that he thinks really changed his perspective is one, you guys can Google it. It's one where he talks about his girlfriend being addicted, in quotation marks, to chocolate. And that joke is a very short joke. It's like a 30-second joke, but that got such a good reaction. That's why he moved into this darker space.
Yeah, and if you don't know Anthony Jeselnik, that's a great starter joke, because if you're like, I don't like that joke, you are not going to like anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That is a good dip in the waters of the Jeselnik Ocean.
Interesting guy. In 2009, he was named one of Comedy Central's Breakout Comedians of the Year alongside, and get this, Nick Kroll, Aziz Ansari, Whitney Cummings, Donald Glover, TJ Miller, Kumail Nanjiani, and John Lejoie.
My God, what I do? He's from the South Shore of Montreal, where I hail from.
So what a group!
That's amazing. Wow.
I mean, everybody is
winners through and through
in that group. Yeah. So shortly after that, he was hired as a writer for Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, and basically he didn't get any of his jokes on because his jokes were just too dark. And Jimmy Fallon, we know, that's not his style, right?
Jimmy is a panderer, and I'm saying that I'm a panderer. Jimmy is somebody who's like, makes everybody feel welcome. That's not what Anthony Jeselnik does. So yeah, that's not everything's for everybody. That's fine.
And then he ended up leaving. He said he wanted to leave, and they said, yeah, you want to be yourself. You want to be Anthony Jeselnik, so leave. And then he started writing for the Comedy Central roast, and that's when he said things really took off for him after that. And I remember, it's funny, I was going to ask you when you first saw him. Now I can remember him being on the Comedy Central roast, but I didn't know who he was, and it didn't really register.
Dude, nobody on the roast knew who he was either. You had this crew of friends, and he's the new guy in school, and everyone was like, who's this cocky, lanky-looking white dude? What's this guy going to do? And he was savage. He really proved himself. I remember seeing him on the Donald Trump roast and the Charlie Sheen roast, and he was great, but I had already known of him prior to that. He had an album in 2010 called Shakespeare, and I believe one of my friends had recorded that, the audio of it only. So I had the audio of that. This was the old days, Asif. People recorded little, USB. I haven't seen a USB drive in quite some time. Yeah, there was USB drives, and I think this was my buddy Faisal Butt gave me a USB drive with about, 17 different Comedy Central Presents albums, and he was one of them. And I'll tell you where I first met this guy. I was taken begrudgingly, and we've spoken about this in relation to Bridget Everett, whose show Somebody Somewhere, what the hell?
That's the name, yeah.
Somebody Somewhere is fantastic, but I saw her on a Nasty Girl show in Montreal. My friend Iman took me there. I went begrudgingly. I don't really like filthy comedy. Turns out I don't like a few male filthy comics. That's what I really don't like. I learned that night. Because these women were all killers, and it was Natasha Leggero, and it was Amy Schumer, and it was Bridget Everett headlining. But later that night at an after party that was exclusively comedians in industry, I see Amy Schumer, and Anthony Jeselnik were dating at the time. So they're side by side, but I don't see him at first. And so I say to her, I said, listen, I got taken on by surprise to the show tonight, and you really, truly blew me away. You were so great. And she's like, oh my God, thank you so much. And then Anthony appears behind her, and I can't lie that, hey man, you're all so great. Like, I hadn't seen him. I hadn't seen him at the festival yet. So I couldn't be like, you're so great too. And also that feels weird to do the two, because they know you're just, giving them like, oh, I feel bad for you, so I'm saying it. And it takes away from the Amy Schumer original compliment a little bit. Oh, this guy just compliments everybody. So I was just kind of stuck there staring at Anthony Jeselnik in the eyes, and he's staring at me. And I was just like, yep, anyway, see you guys around. And I was like, that was weird. It was a lose-lose situation no matter what. I don't even know how
You
I would have corrected
overthought that in an Asif Doja kind of style.
Yeah, all in the span of 3 seconds. I had all the Asif Doja thoughts I've ever had in my life. So I just remember that moment, and then watching Anthony over the years and watching Amy Schumer over the years. I'm like, I wish I had that moment back right now. Amy, you sit down. Anthony, you're a champ. No, I wouldn't have said that. But yeah, it's obviously, that's when I remember him, meeting him face to face. And I already knew him from a couple of the roasts. This was early, like, I'm going to say 2013, 2014, maybe. I should have just said that. That's what I should have said. You were great on the roast, man. I haven't seen you at the festival, but I don't know. It was just a quick moment at a festival.
It's okay. It's okay. You'll be okay. It was, 10 years
Thoughts
ago.
and prayers? Thoughts and prayers to me?
Yeah,
the name of
exactly.
his special.
So that's actually the name of one of his specials. So let's get into this. I didn't really see a lot of his, he had a show on Comedy Central called the Jeselnik Offensive, which was kind of a Daily Show style thing. He'd do things like he'd go and do stand-up that's cancer related for a cancer support group. Or he'll do it to a bunch of Muslims and make Muslim jokes. And the clips I saw, it was pretty funny, pretty good stuff. But did you watch that show at all?
Bro, I've never even heard of that show until we started doing research for this episode. I'm a fan of this man. I've never heard of that show.
I definitely heard of it before, but that was about it. So anyway, it was okay. But anyway, we'll talk about why I like his newer stuff a bit better in a second. So one of the things in this article is they talk about, developing comedy and not losing your edge over time, right? And he says, when the interviewer's talking to him, the interviewer's like, why are you worried about keeping things fresh? Because people can sometimes anticipate the dark, corners you're going to turn to and try and second guess it. And, he's like, people being familiar with you and knowing what you're going to do, those are champagne problems really for a comedian. Like the fact that people know you and know your style so much that they can sometimes guess what you're going to say. He's like, is that really an issue? I don't know. What do you think about that? So again, a lot of these things that he brings up, I want to ask you about from a stand-up perspective.
Yeah. What do you mean? What do I think about that specifically?
Do you agree that okay, well, that is something to worry about, but really it's a champagne problem?
I see what he's saying there, right? The champagne problem being, I have a very large following of people who come out to see me, and in these live venues, their mind is racing to try to figure out what I'm going to say before I say it. The important point is I have a large following of people coming to see me. That's the important part. That's what makes it a champagne problem. Like, okay, and you try to be as fresh as possible. I imagine I don't think he'd feel great if man, my punchline got yelled out 6 times before I delivered it tonight. I'm sure he's the type of guy, based on everything we know about him, particularly from this article, he would rewrite that material. As I said, slave to the craft. He would rewrite. He goes, this is too easy because people are guessing what the punchline is.
And this is why I'm so impressed by him. Not in the special. I do think his jokes are so clever and they do misdirect you. But it's the fact that he is always thinking about these things. Clearly, he spends all his day thinking and writing and thinking and writing. So he tells a story. The first 15 minutes is basically a trans joke. It's not really a joke about trans people. You have to watch it to kind of see. And it starts off when he made a joke, and then somebody after his comedy show came up to him and said, I think that joke's a bit transphobic. It was actually a trans comedian who told him that.
We don't know that from the special, but we know that now,
yes,
having read the article.
In his interview, he says that. And so he's thought to himself, what do I do with this feedback? Do I just, who cares? Because people were laughing anyway, so who cares? Or do I try and think about that, maybe incorporate that into his material? And he did. And he said, how do I address this and incorporate this into my act? That's what he did. He incorporated this person coming up to him and telling him. And he's like, PC culture is the norm. And there are opportunities in the fact that you have to be PC. It's not a dead end. And I just thought it was a very interesting way of approaching that, instead of just getting your back up and being like, if it's funny, who cares, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think he says in this article too, I think he's a guy who really holds himself to a very high standard. I have a friend, Nathan McIntosh, who's doing extremely well in the US right now, who lives in New York, originally from Canada. He's very similar in the sense that he goes, I don't care if Chris Rock gave me a joke. I'm like, get away from me. I want to think about the joke myself. That's the fun of it. You're taking the fun out of it. Don't give me a, you know what you should have said. You know what might be a good tag there. He's not into that. So when you tell somebody that that might be transphobic, you go, okay, he probably respects this comedian who came up to him. The comedian was like, wow, you really roasted me. But really, that wasn't the point. I think, yeah, he takes, and that's the guy who writes hundreds and hundreds of jokes for a roast, inevitably is the person who is able to be like, I'll just write it better. I'll just write more.
Right.
I'll just write it again. I'll rewrite it and tweak it till it's better. And that's, I think that work ethic of his is super impressive. And I don't think all comedians have it. And I think the fan base he has is for that reason. I think it's people who truly, truly are purists. If you see Anthony Jeselnik right now and you don't know who he is, you might be like, what the hell is going on right now? If you don't understand this style. But if you've seen him over the years, you're just like, man, just aging like a fine wine, this guy. And why? Because he crafts it. Takes 5 years between specials, he was saying. I want the joke to be perfect. I don't want it to be just something anybody could have written.
Yeah, he tours for 2 years and then he records a special. After really working through the jokes. And as you said, he does this character. And I watched his old stuff and then I watched the new special. I think he has a confidence, his delivery now in his new special. I think I like it a bit better. He's not trying to prove anything basically now, where I got the sense of that when he was younger, like 20 years ago, that he was always trying to prove something. And
well, as you can imagine, he would need to also though, right? You're a 25-year-old or you're under 30 and you're trying to crack a scene with like these veteran writers and performers. And so, yeah, you always have to prove yourself. Inevitably, you'll start looking like you're trying to prove yourself as well. But yeah, no, this is this is my favorite version because he talks about, evolving as a human being. This is my favorite version.
Exactly. So one of the things he talks about in this interview is how Norm MacDonald, who we talked about recently on the podcast, was a huge influence to him. So interestingly, Jeselnik was offered the hosting role on Last Comic Standing, the TV show in the US, and he only took it because Norm MacDonald was going to be a judge on it. But unfortunately, they didn't get along during it. And so I think a part of it is Jeselnik's like, I'm going to be making fun of what you say as a judge. And I think Norm MacDonald, like, what are you doing? So they didn't get along. In the stand-up special, he says they didn't get along for half of the filming. But I've seen some interviews with him, and I don't know if they got along actually at all during it.
Maybe only at the very end when they were finally doing promo for it. But it's, he also says in the article that it was two guys who really didn't want to be there. He said, when my agent said they're looking at you for this hosting gig, he's like, no, why? That show sucks. That was his words. And I don't know if you watched when Norm MacDonald was a judge.
No.
There has never been somebody less interested in doing what they're doing. There's never been somebody less interesting. He didn't critique anybody. He didn't give anybody it was so weird. You're waiting for like the Norm, to show up. And all he kept saying was like, yeah, it's good. No, just keep writing, man. Well, it's good. He was just so oddly supportive in the most sort of unenthusiastic way. Supportive words, no enthusiasm. He hated being there. And it was very clear to anybody who was a fan of Norm MacDonald's.
Yeah. When you say it like that, I can imagine why they kind of clash. The sad part is I was watching some clips on YouTube, and Jeselnik was on Howie Mandel's podcast a couple of years ago. And during the podcast, in real time, Howie Mandel finds out that Norm MacDonald died. And he's like, oh my gosh, Howie Mandel's like, this is my countryman. It's really upsetting. And Jeselnik is just basically in shock, right? This was
He was in shock that Howie Mandel was from Canada?
The Howie Mandel had a podcast. He couldn't believe it.
Yeah. that he agreed to do it.
That's right. So no, just in shock that, of course, that Norm MacDonald died. And then he mentioned that, we didn't get along on the Comedy Central TV show. It was an awkward situation for sure to find that out live while you're on a podcast. But it's interesting.
That your heroes died.
Yeah, it does seem that Jeselnik is an introvert. There's another thing where in the article where it says, some comedians, he says, love like their set is fine, but what they really love is hanging out with the other comics afterwards, just like riffing on each other, and they live for that, right? And he's like, I don't do that. I go do my work and then I go
Yeah.
home. The writing is fun. And it's performing in front of people. And I don't want to meet people after the show. I just want to go back to my hotel. So what do you think of that? I'm very curious.
Well, I think this is part of what makes him great, man. Like if you look at this Wikipedia page, you know, you'd mentioned he went to Tulane University, which you pronounced Tulane as though it's TWO. It's famous
Could be.
place,
I know, famous university in
in
New Orleans.
Louisiana. There, yep. You know, he has this introductory chunk to who he is. It doesn't mention his mother, father, siblings, or any single detail of his life prior to his 20s. We know nothing about his personal life. And I think the type of comedy he does, this is just my hunch, you know, what do I know? But I feel like he protects the people who are close to him. He doesn't want them to be, so you don't, like if you look me up on the internet, the second thing is Ali Hassan's wife. That's the second thing. People are like, who's this guy married to? He makes fun of his wife. We want to know who he's married to. There was something about like Ali Hassan's wife's salary or something. Some weird site out of India was saying my wife makes $65,000 a year. My wife's like, I do? This is amazing news. And my wife doesn't work. So she was very excited about that. But there's like, you know, even a guy like me, people are like, you know, imposing stuff on it. So, and information is out there, real information and fake. This guy, I feel like he's gone out of his way to protect people close to him so that he can do the humor that he does. Yeah, I don't know. I respect it very much. I'm definitely the social guy. I'm definitely the guy hang, make fun of people, get made fun of. I love that. That's a big deal. My wife will tell you I spent many hours coming home way too late, just sort of, you know, reeking of Vietnamese food, 3 a.m. Why did you have to stay out? Why the comedy, half of comedy is the social thing. It's not. It can be. I like it, but it doesn't have to be. And I remember Eliza Schlesinger got a lot of shit about this too when she was talking about young women in comedy. She was like, what are you doing at the comedy club after midnight? What are you doing? All you're doing is hanging out with drunk male comedians, giving them ideas. You're not doing anything to further your career. Go home, get some rest, wake up, write jokes, get on stage. You know, like she's very like, some people really didn't like that because they love the social element and they have friends who they hang out with, this kind of stuff. And it sounded like, you know, the male comedians are just out to be complete predators. And so women should protect themselves from it. But I understood in my mind what the kernel of that was. It's the same thing you tell a teenager, you know, it's like nothing good happens after midnight. Just come home by midnight, nothing good. Everything bad, crime, drunkenness, sexual impropriety, that's when that starts. And it feels like that in comedy too. And you're 3 years old in comedy, get the F home, you know, get home. It's a new day tomorrow where you don't have to be like the drunken weirdo and then people.
Ali should be taking his own advice, but that's another story.
I like to be wasted at 3 a.m.
Okay. So a couple of things he brings up in the article. He talks about how he doesn't like storytelling personally as a comedian. He just prefers the brief setup, punchline, and move on. I was curious what you thought about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very much in line with it. He says his favorite comedians were Rodney Dangerfield, Stephen Wright, and his hero was Norm MacDonald. What do all those people have in common? You don't know a goddamn thing about their lives from their comedy. You don't know anything. Rodney's life was a little bit more public just because of his own foibles, but otherwise, you know, you just don't know. So I think he loves that. It's a total devotion to joke writing.
Yeah.
The whole thing is writing the jokes, and it's tied into this idea of somebody giving him a joke. He's like, don't give me a joke. I don't want your joke. No matter how funny it is, I want to write my own jokes. That's my fun. So that's where what he gets joy out of. I also get joy out of the social part of it, but you don't have to. That's not an obligation. And maybe some people might say, well, his career would have been better sooner had he been the guy people think of when they're thinking of booking for comedy and this and that. But sometimes your talent speaks for itself as well.
I certainly think he would get more acting roles. A good-looking guy, you know, but it's because he's this very particular character he plays on stage. So the other thing he talks about, very interesting stuff, he talks about cancel culture, which we've talked about before on the podcast, but I think this is the best, or one of the best things I've ever seen in terms of someone address cancel culture. And he quote what he says in the article. He says, people tell basically a bad joke and people don't laugh, and then the comedians complain, you just can't say anything anymore. And he says, to me, that is embarrassing as a comedian. They're saying cancel culture is bad, we're above it, come to this special comedy club where everyone laughs. And he's like, that's weak. He's like, comedy's not dangerous if there's not consequences. That's part of comedy. And these people want to take consequences out of comedy. The joy, if you can use that term, in watching Jeselnik's work is that he does tackle these dark subjects, so dark, and then you're laughing, right? Sometimes people don't laugh, and then he says he has to do a backup joke and get that in, but he just says, people are getting upset and complaining about this cancel culture, but he's like, no, you just deal with it. There has to be consequences, right?
I read, and we just said, Asif, you just said what we've talked about on this podcast, but what I really loved was also, he just said, I just don't find it that interesting to talk, right? And it is a little bit hacky at this point, if not a lot bit hacky, to just blame, like the same people who blame the audience for stuff, you blame cancel culture, and it's not really often, we've talked about this at length, it's not a real thing, because you are on stage in front of thousands, doing a special on a major streamer, complaining about cancel culture. Like, obviously it doesn't exist, you idiot. Do you not see the irony in what you're saying?
And his whole point, getting back to that trans comedian who came up to him and gave him feedback, he's like, oh, I'm going to incorporate this into my act, instead of being like, well, I don't care, it's funny. And, he clearly, when he brings up this trans bit, he is referencing Dave Chappelle. He is referencing Dave Chappelle. And in the article, that's what the reporter asks him. And he says, yeah, I was, but it's more powerful to not use his name. And everybody knows who I'm talking about. And, he's hoping that this would make 99% of trans material basically stop being used, in terms of making fun of trans people. He's like, can we just stop doing that now? It's just not funny. It's like making racist jokes, and using racial slurs. Like, you don't have to do this anymore. And so he's hoping actually to move things forward. Just the idea that he's thinking about that when he's constructing these dark comedic jokes. I don't know. Like, the guy is a smart guy, man.
Yeah, absolutely. He said the same thing with his special that was called Thoughts and Prayers. His hope was that I've made so much fun of it that hopefully people will think twice before saying thoughts and prayers, my thoughts and prayers, right? And rendering it exactly as useless as thoughts and prayers often are.
We'll end on this one topic, Ali. I want to see if you have the same thought as me. Obviously, Stephen Wright, as you said, is a huge influence. Stephen Wright is just a comedic genius, in my opinion. He's so funny and has that economy. You talk about the economy of words, right? Like,
yeah.
I don't know, is there a comic, maybe Mitch Hedberg, but like, who has such, brief time period between setup and punchline, right? It's so quick. But I don't think he sounds like Stephen Wright. I think the reporter did, but I'm not sure even Jeselnik thinks he sounds like Stephen Wright, even though he's influenced. But there is somebody who I do think he sounds like all the time. And do you know who that is? An actor?
No, who is that?
He sounds like Christopher Walken. It's crazy how much he sounds like him.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't think he's putting it on. I don't think so. I think he just sometimes sounds like that. And to be fair, in interviews, he says, people think I'm talking like Christopher Walken, but my dad does sound like that. So he's more like imitating his dad as opposed to Walken. But anyway, you can see that about the way he talks.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a critical part of who he is, because it maintains the conceit that he's doing a character, right? He doesn't actually talk like that. It's a very almost rigid, every word thought out. It's a very unique way of expressing yourself. And I think that's important for his comedy to work as well.
Yeah, so I encourage people to definitely check out this latest special if what we said interests you, and definitely this Cracked article, we will link to it. Just, I don't know, I was impressed so much, and it makes me rethink some of these quote-unquote edgy comedians that we've seen over the past couple of years in edgy stand-up things, and I'm like, I don't think you're getting it, and I think he does.
Yeah. And, just to add on that, one last thing is he talks about podcasts. And of course, he has a podcast. He's on podcast, all this kind of stuff. But He's just like, podcast used to be friends coming together, hanging out. And he goes, I really don't like what it's become, which is this vehicle to making money. In fact, it's part and parcel of the money you're making in the sense that this is how you sell tickets. So if you come on a podcast and you're not in a good mood and you're not a great guest, now you just cost somebody money.
Right.
Or if you say something against someone, hey man, you can't say that because, you know, that's somebody I don't want to upset because of my career. And he's like, this has also become kind of embarrassing for comedy. And you think you're like so rock and roll, but in the end, you're like, I don't want to offend this person. Don't want to offend this person. I'm going to move to this city to be closer to this person who does comedy. And he's, again, the purist that he is, he's embarrassed by a lot of that, which only makes us respect him more.
And of course, just so people can be absolutely clear about this, we don't make any money on this podcast. In fact, it's a money loser, but that's a story for another day.
Are you not making money? Are the checks coming to me directly only? That's too bad, buddy. We are talking about psychopathic and antisocial personality disorder. How are they related, first of all, and why did you choose this subject? Because often it's me coming to you saying this is very interesting, and you're like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What has this top of mind for you? I'm wondering, do you see it in your practice? How common it is? Is it more with adults? When does it start? This kind of stuff. So let's talk about why you picked this.
Questions.
Yeah.
These are all good questions. So I chose it because as I was watching Jeselnik's special, I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's so dark. And I did think he's trying to sometimes be like a psychopath or have this antisocial personality. So I thought that would be interesting. I'm like, we haven't really talked about this. It's a bit more on the psychology, psychiatry aspect, but I thought that would be interesting. I don't see that many kids with it, thankfully. Certainly, I think I have known people who have these personality traits, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And where
why are you
might
pointing
run
at
into
me?
People.
Why are you pointing at me right through your screen?
And they are different. So let's save the talk about psychopathy or psychopaths for the end. Okay. And I'll draw the distinction at the end. But we'll start off by talking about antisocial personality disorder. And that's the terminology we use. That's what's in the DSM-5. Okay.
DSM being the Diagnostic Systems Manual, which is the Bible for doctors in case you do.
Statistical manual.
Yeah, I always get it wrong, and I will continue to get it wrong because that's my little jab at your community. No, I just don't know why. The word statistics, why would I even think? Is it called APS, the way borderline is, BPD and this kind of stuff?
They say ASPD, but
ASPD.
I don't use that, but I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist.
Okay.
So then when we talk about sociopaths and sociopathy, easiest way is to just use that interchangeably with antisocial personality disorder.
Okay. So somebody with ASPD.
ASPD. That's what
ASPD. Yeah. Why is it harder to give abbreviations than actually say the word? Someone with this personality disorder is basically sociopathic or a sociopath.
Right.
We are saying that they're interchangeable.
That's right.
Okay.
But think about sociopath, it's a bit more you use in the older literature, sometimes the psychology literature, and maybe more just in common discussion. So in medicine, we usually just use antisocial personality disorder. It'd be rare to write someone has sociopathy. That's just unusual in medicine.
Okay.
It'll be different in psychology. So basically, what is this? So then we're talking about
what does it look like?
Antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah.
So this is basically a ongoing and pervasive pattern of disregarding and violating the rights of other people in any way. Okay. And usually it starts in childhood or adolescence. We'll talk about that in a second, and then persists through an individual's life. So that means people engage in criminal behavior because, of course, that's violating other people's rights. And they have a lot of difficulty learning from the negative consequences of their action. So they often manipulate other people, lack empathy. That's a key thing.
Yeah.
To me, that's really one of the issues is you have the inability to empathize with other people or feel guilt.
When you say the main thing, it's like if you meet somebody who lacks empathy, then you're going to dig deeper to see if they have this personality disorder?
Yeah,
is
it's
that
very
kind of thing?
unusual for people to say that to you, that they lack empathy or don't feel guilt. But if they do, yeah, I'd be concerned. How about that?
Yeah.
Because those are just natural things that the average person tends to feel.
Well, I remember, we don't love bringing up Louis C.K. on this podcast, but I remember him talking, I think on Conan, about this idea of like his concerns about the internet. And, when you'd make somebody feel bad face to face, you could see their face fall, you could see their body language drop, and you could see how you make somebody feel. And you would be like, oh, that didn't feel good to do that, and maybe correct that behavior. But he said, when you bully somebody on the internet, when you victimize somebody in some way, you don't see their reaction. You just press send and then you go off about my day. I'm the best. So I'd love to know if there's a connection between technology and younger people getting it. Is it influenced by social media or the internet at all? If you have that information.
Yeah,
that's
not that I've come across. I don't think so. I think, the internet may allow more opportunities for people with the antisocial personality disorder to affect and violate the rights of others.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think you need to think about this. Say you have these two kids or teenagers and one of them is bullying someone online, but they don't see the consequences. But then you can just turn around and say, how would you feel if someone's doing this to you? And if you have no concept of how that would feel, and I know some kids would be like, oh, I wouldn't care. But you know that they really do. So,
yeah.
But if you really cannot empathize with that, or turn the tables and see how you would feel about that, or feel bad about that, that would be concerning. But I don't think so, because this is a pretty deep-rooted personality disorder. But let's talk about it. Obviously, you want to ask about what the roots are of it, what causes it, and so a lot of people will have in childhood something called conduct disorder. Okay, so conduct, you think, oh, okay, just misbehaving kids, but it's much more than that. So conduct disorder only occurs in children and adolescents, but they, again, violate the fundamental rights of others or disregard societal norms. So they show aggression towards people, often towards animals, okay? Destruction of property, like lighting fires, constant deceitfulness, theft, and these serious rule violations. So most children who have the conduct disorder won't develop antisocial personality disorder, but a lot of people who have antisocial personality will have had conduct disorder when they were younger.
Yeah. And how common is it? And is it more common now than it ever was, or is it sort of stable?
That's an interesting question. So the prevalence in the general population is about 2 to 3%. So not uncommon, right?
Yeah.
But then you think about people who are incarcerated, and they say that in male inmates in the past, let's say in maybe the 1990s or before that, it was 80% of male inmates and 60% of female inmates. But they think that the presence of this antisocial personality disorder in the US may be declining in prison populations. Can you guess why? I'm curious if you can figure out why that is.
The presence of this disorder is declining
in prison populations.
Yeah.
So it used to be like, say, 80% of males, but now it's less. And do you know why? It has to do with the way the justice system has been working in the U.S., say, for the past 30 plus years. It's due to harsher sentencing laws. So more people are being sentenced to prison, and who, just maybe in the wrong situation, got involved in gangs or other sort of...
Or have a bag of weed in their pocket or whatever it is, right?
These types of things in harsher sentences. They're not antisocial personality. They don't have a disregard. They don't lack empathy, but they end up being incarcerated. So they think now it's about 35%. A recent study said that in incarcerated males, the incidence of antisocial personality. So most people will demonstrate antisocial personality traits about 80% by age 11. But sometimes you can even see it in the preschool years, which is kind of scary. And I certainly have seen, I'm just trying to think if I've had patients like that.
2 to 3% means, yeah, exactly. 2 to 3% means everybody has seen at least one kid in their life with this. I remember having these neighbors a few houses down, 3 boys, and the middle boy, their parents were so worried about this guy because he was so different from the 2 other brothers. And it was exactly what you just said. Petty crime. I mean, this is like a 10-year-old, 8 to 10, right? Lighting fires, committing crimes, vandalism, and he got genuine joy and satisfaction out of doing that. And there was no level of punishment that would dissuade him it really felt like a hard wiring. And I think, yeah, most people would have met some kid like that along the way. And if you haven't, you're that kid. Now that's a classic hacky comedy line. But on the note of this, neighbor that I used to have, do we know what causes it? That family was certainly baffled, and I think probably know the answer to this, but are there factors that contribute to having this disorder, or are there some common traits in kids who have these disorders? I'm just trying to get any way of you saying we don't know. I'm trying to give you something else.
We don't. There is a genetic predisposition, most likely, because there's a higher rate of concordance in identical twins versus fraternal twins in terms of having antisocial personality.
Oh, really?
So there's got to be a genetic influence, but we don't have a gene or anything we could test for. We do know that there are a lot of things that can put you at risk for it. So definitely neglect and abuse, in the household when you're growing up, for sure, is associated to it. And of course, that's involving the parenting styles, but, it's pretty extreme, obviously, with this neglect abuse, but that can certainly do it. There's also temperament. So temperament is kind of the way that one naturally reacts to a situation, your innate behavioral kind of personality traits. So there are some temperament domains where you can see patterns. So one is like harm avoidance. So, basically we don't do things. We're a bit more timid because, we don't want something bad to happen, right? The natural reaction. But people with antisocial personality have low harm avoidance, right? Because they don't see the consequences of their actions. Novelty seeking. So some people like to do new, interesting things, right? Oh yeah, I like to try base jumping or skydiving. Yeah, and of course, people with antisocial personality have a high novelty seeking behaviors. Another thing is reward dependence, right? I want to do something. Did you want to ask me something?
I just thought of like adrenaline junkies there. That's not, there's a loose correlation, but it doesn't mean you should watch out.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I should just say this before we continue with the temperament. It doesn't mean that because you have these temperaments, you're going to develop antisocial personality. It's just that we see these types of temperaments more commonly in some people. So the next one is like reward dependence, right? So I want to do something nice for, you and your family because I like to make you guys feel good. Yeah? So I'll bring you guys some treats when I come. And then Ollie gets upset that I'm bringing donuts to his family. So
I just want them to be better quality treats. That's all.
That's right.
Dark chocolate. And Asif goes, suck your dark chocolate. I hate dark chocolate. Yeah.
But individuals with antisocial personality have low reward dependence, right? Because they don't care about these extrinsic factors. And then, persistence is an interesting thing. This is like continuing to go and push ahead despite obstacles, frustration, fatigue, right? So Ali and I I'm going to say, we are two people who show this persistence temperament, right? You can't become a doctor if you can't say, okay, well, it takes a long time and, you have to go through all this schooling and you get to where you're doing. You can't become a stand-up comedian. There's, years of rejection, things not going your way, empty clubs, people hating you. What else happened to you?
Stop talking about it.
No, I know, no. And then to become as successful as Ali is. Interesting, people with antisocial personality have low persistence and then tend to abandon things when they encounter challenges.
How interesting, because I would have thought some of the comedians I've met in my life definitely have antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah, exactly. And then but we'll talk a bit about this. Maybe they're more in the psychopaths, which we'll talk about in a second. But before we get there, let's get to the DSM-5 TR. We're at the TR now, DSM-5 TR criteria. Okay, you ready? So there's 4 criteria. Okay. The first is a pervasive pattern of disregard for and the violation of others' rights. And you need to have a few of these sub-features. Okay, you ready? Failure to conform to social norms concerning lawful behavior, so breaking the law, deceitfulness and lying, impulsivity or failure to plan, irritability and aggressiveness, often resulting in fights, reckless disregard for the safety of others, consistent irresponsibility, so you can't keep a job or honor, monetary obligations, and then a lack of remorse. So if you have 3 of those, okay, that's part of the criteria, then you also have to be at least 18 years old, have this conduct disorder before age 15, and not having antisocial behaviors in the course of either schizophrenia or bipolar or something like that, right? And so that's basically what it is. But it's really those things that I listed where you need 3 of those qualities that kind of like make the diagnosis. So you tell me, Ali, in terms of the friends and comedians you have.
Little bit, shades of some of it. Certainly, I've seen, but nothing that gets in the way of them being also contributing members of society, right? It sounds like if you've got a full blown case of this disorder, it's not long until you're imprisoned, obviously. But I think we throw around the word sociopath a little bit too loosely, probably as a society, but certainly as comedians. I think it's like what we think we see as sociopaths is really more like narcissists, like.
Exactly. I totally agree with you.
When something happens to them, it's really, they can feel it like, I can't believe this happened to me. I can't believe these people were like it. But then they can't seem to flip it around like, well, what about how that person felt? What about how that group felt when you said what you said to them, right? That's all. I think it's more. Yeah. How do you diagnose this? What is the way to confirm that you have it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just with those criteria that I said. It's as simple. So it would be the physician doing an interview with a person. The problem is, of course, there's sometimes not a lot of insight into what's going on, right? And people often don't want to seek help. So, getting someone in the door to actually diagnose them, that's kind of the difficult part.
Yeah, right. And then I'm sure there's a little bit of lying going like, empathy? Big fan. Right. Always been a big fan.
Exactly,
Love it. Yeah. So I'm sure there's some trick questions to get around that. And then what is the treatment once you've determined that somebody has it and let's say they're willing to get help because they know that their life is going to be, behind bars or something worse? How do you treat it?
It's tough. It usually is lifelong and very refractory to treatment. Now,
what does that mean?
Refractory means treatments don't work. Sorry.
Really?
Yeah. So it's tough. Now, I want to give you some positive stuff. So a lot of those kids who were diagnosed with conduct disorder, so they say about 25% of girls and 40% of boys who are diagnosed with conduct disorder eventually develop antisocial personality, which means the majority do not. Okay. So if you're seeing conduct disorder, you can intervene at that time and then hopefully they can improve. Even people who have antisocial personality, they say about 12 to 27% can remit. But of course, that means a lot don't. And the mean age, if you do have remission, is around 35. Why people remit, we don't know, but they do think that this is probably the most difficult personality disorder to treat. And like I was saying, people often don't see a need to be treated, right? Like, why would I need to be treated? They don't have motivation to change their behavior. They don't see the costs associated with antisocial acts. So why would you change your behavior? And as you said, they will often simulate remorse rather than truly changing, right? And, I think the fact that some of people who have this can be charming and dishonest, manipulate other people. There are some things that you don't want to admit them involuntarily because of the behaviors they can impact on other people who are admitted to a psychiatric ward. Psychotherapy, like talk therapy, has seemed to help. They say some of this talk therapy, you focus on kind of rational or utilitarian arguments against repeating past mistakes, as opposed to trying to make people develop a conscience, right? Like that is probably not going to happen.
Okay, so then I assume we've arrived at the moment where we can discuss psychopaths.
It's interesting. Some researchers basically will say that psychopathy is like a form of antisocial personality disorder. Other people say it's different. Other people will say that people may have psychopathic traits. So yeah, it just depends on who you read. The American Psychological Association says psychopathy isn't just another term for antisocial personality. But other researchers say that it's separate with some overlap. So I think it's interesting thinking about how those people look at it, right?
I'm ready to get the comparison, yeah.
Okay.
Because again, another term that we throw around quite loosely in society, right? Yeah.
So have impaired empathy and a lack of remorse. Okay, we talked about that. But in combination with traits of boldness, disinhibition, and egocentrism. Okay?
You've been describing Elon Musk so far with those 5 things.
I'll get back to that in a second.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything about Elon Musk specifically. And they're often masked by superficial charm. Oh, I guess that doesn't include Elon Musk.
How dare you? He's such a charming man. How dare you, Asif?
So they have a superficial charm and they have an immunity to stress. Okay? They don't seem to be bothered by anything. And of course, there is a very famous person who is a Canadian psychologist named Robert D. Hare, Hare, who kind of repopularized this term, especially in criminology and in criminal science. And he created this psychopathy checklist. And that's what you may have heard about. Like, even some people will take it online, or they'll do it for people that they know to kind of see. So I think I kind of agree. I think it's describing a very specific subset of people who fulfill the criteria for antisocial personality. What's interesting, though, is because of the charm, the boldness, the immunity to stress, I don't know how much it interferes with their life when they have this. And in fact, you could potentially be quite successful because of some of these traits, right?
Still Elon Musk.
Well, okay. So, yeah, okay. This is all, Ali is alleging this, by the way. So there is this idea that's come about over the past several years that we could have psychopaths in the C-suite, as they say, right? The CEOs of companies, etc. And two psychologists looked at comparing the incidence of personality disorders in business executives against criminals who were in a mental hospital. Okay, so people had criminal acts, but they were in a psychiatric ward, and they found that a lot of the senior business managers had very significant elements very similar to the people who were in the mental hospital. And so the boldness, the disinhibition, meanness overall. And of course, there's a couple things going on. They have those traits, but they also have probably a favorable upbringing, probably high intelligence, right? And there's immunity to stress. Makes people kind of label this group of people successful psychopaths, in quotation marks, or corporate psychopaths. So, and they may not have the extensive history of the criminal or antisocial behavior, right, that the other people would.
Can't help but think about this United Healthcare CEO as well, right? A lot of people were sort of framing him as a person who didn't care about how many claims got denied and how many people wound up dying he was painted as a success, and every day he probably went home feeling like a success as well.
I can't speak to him about this, but you can see why.
No, you can't speak to him because he was murdered on a.
Well, I also don't know anything about him, whether his personality type, and what he was like as a person. But you can imagine, like I said, the people who are successful as business, people who probably are bold, who don't really care if they crush other people, right? Or the consequences.
Well, yeah, this is what I'm thinking about the Jeff Bezos, the Amazon, you try to form a union at Amazon. No, why? Why not? Why not? Oh, because that would give workers rights. God forbid they had rights, right? Elon Musk obviously doesn't care about anybody, and that's well documented. And then, these CEOs of insurance companies, that's kind of like their MO, politicians the same way. So it's particularly unsettling when it's healthcare CEOs, because it's not actually healthcare, and then it's very unsettling when it's politicians. You're supposed to be responsible to people, and you actually aren't bothered by anything that happens to people.
Yeah. So Robert Hare, who's the psychologist I mentioned before, the Canadian psychologist, he says that these traits are higher in the business world than the general population. So around 3 to 4% for senior business positions. And I can see it. And if I think about people I know or who I've had some contact with who I think might fulfill the psychopath, like I said, I actually don't know too many people who fulfill the antisocial personality disorder, especially in medicine. That would be quite unusual. And even the psychopathy in medicine, I'm trying to think if I know anyone or I've ever encountered someone like that. I'm sure there are. The people I know have been kicked out of residency or kicked out of, medical school who demonstrate these traits, but thankfully they were caught early on. So I guess you could say there's got to be people who don't escape or who don't get caught and then move up the ladder. I just can't think of any. But the people I know personally are more corporate people, like business people. I like to think of some pretty clear examples of people I know who are like that. So stay tuned next week when I provide you the list of people.
Yes, finally, the juicy gossip we've been waiting for. That's how the podcast gets paid.
that's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought about the episode. Again, Anthony Jeselnik, very curious to see if you guys are fans of his. Like, if we compare him to Ali, different styles of comedy. I do think Ali has some of this in his comedy with the misdirection and people thinking that he's going in one direction or another. But I'd say the darkness, Ali rarely
Darkness is not, I can't. No. I respect it very much. It's wild. And what we didn't talk about is how alone you feel as this type of a comedian coming up. I had a friend in Montreal the friend might be too strong. I had a colleague in Montreal who was this type of a comedian, and it was like, I would say 30% of the time he was absolutely killing. And 70% of the time people are like, what the hell is this? This is not what I left out. Yeah, you have to be committed. Yeah.
I tell you, so impressive. Like I said, I really like this most recent special. One of my favorite specials I've seen in the past 10 years, probably. I really enjoyed it. So thanks to Ali for suggesting him, mentioning him, that we got to talk about him in the podcast. Let us know what you guys think. drvcomedian@gmail.com, Dr. V Comedian on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are everywhere. What do you got going on, this winter coming up, Ali?
I'll be in Maple Ridge, I'll be in Nelson, BC, and I'll be in Edmonton for 4 nights in February. You look up the Citadel Theater. Capital is in Moncton. You look up the Citadel Theater, and I'm there for 4 nights, possibly 5 if things go well. So come and have some laughs and make things go well.
Sounds good to me. But before everybody goes, remember one thing, that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.